Welcome to this introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes on Sunday mornings between now and Christmas, and then on into the new year as well. So hopefully you'll find this a helpful overview of the whole book before we get into individual passages in the next few weeks. There are some handouts to go with this seminar. You can find those in the description under this video, or you can email the church office and they'll send them to you. And you might find them helpful to have them in front of you. Look, if you read through Ecclesiastes, you will know that at first sight it seems a bit out of place in the Bible. The opening statement of Ecclesiastes in chapter 1 verse 2 seems to jar with the hope that resonates throughout the rest of Scripture. I mean, just listen to verse 2 of chapter 1. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. That's a strange way to start a book, isn't it? Especially a book in the Bible. And if we think this opening statement is just a literary technique to make us sit up and keep reading, we'd be wrong, because Ecclesiastes declares that life is meaningless an incredible 38 times in its 12 chapters. What's all that about? How has a book that declares life is meaningless managed to find its way into the Bible, and what on earth will we gain by studying it? Well, the key is seeing both the perspective and the purpose of the author of Ecclesiastes. When we grasp these two things, what we see is, in the words of one theologian, that Ecclesiastes is the most contemporary book in the Bible. Another theologian, Sidney Greediness, puts it like this: the book is like a Rembrandt painting, where the dark background and figures draw one's eyes to the figures in the light. The teacher's dark background of vanity and death seeks to draw the reader to the elements in the light. The light is the focal point of the teacher's message, but only in contrast to the darkness of life without God. Just hang on to that thought, because it will be important as we make our way through Ecclesiastes. The light is the focal point of the teacher's message, although much of the book, as we're going to see, is dark and gloomy and pessimistic. But we mustn't be put off by that, because at key moments in the book there are glimmers of light, and that's the focal point of the teacher's message. So we need to keep that firmly in mind as we read this book. That the negative tone of the book is intended to draw our attention to the positive message that is also there, but is less obvious and a bit harder to see. And while this seems therefore a pessimistic book at first glance, it is actually, as I hope we're going to see, a book that is full of hope. But before we look at the perspective and purpose of the author of Ecclesiastes, we need to ask the four basic questions that are always important to ask whenever we study a book of the Bible. Firstly, what's the genre of the book? Answer: Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes belongs to a genre of literature called wisdom literature, which was commonplace in the ancient world. But Israel's wisdom literature was unique. It was different because it assumed the existence of a creator God who rules over the world in all its mess and brokenness. Other than Ecclesiastes, the other wisdom books in the Bible are Proverbs, Job, and Song of Songs, which each come at wisdom from slightly different perspectives. Proverbs, for example, is a more general book about wisdom. It's about finding wisdom in a fallen world and not making a fool of yourself. Job is about finding hope in a fallen world, particularly in the context of suffering. Song of Songs is about finding love in a fallen world, particularly in the context of romantic love and marriage. And Ecclesiastes is about finding joy, satisfaction, contentment in a fallen world. These wisdom books make general observations and draw general conclusions about how life in a fallen world tends to work, and about how fallen human beings tend to behave. But the purpose of these general observations and general conclusions are to help us to learn how to live wisely in a fallen world and not make fools of ourselves. And so because wisdom literature is full of general observations and general conclusions, it has a bias towards general principles that tend to be true most of the time, rather than concrete promises that are true all of the time. We need to keep that in mind when reading Ecclesiastes. In one scenario, one thing might be the wise thing to do. In another scenario, something the complete opposite might be a wise thing to do. We often see that in Proverbs, for example, and we'll see that in Ecclesiastes as well. But it's important to bear in mind that the purpose of this book is to help us live wisely, not to depress us. So secondly, who's the author of the book? Answer: Ecclesiastes is written by someone called the teacher. The author of Ecclesiastes identifies himself in verse 1. Look at verse 1. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Now, the Hebrew word for teacher is a difficult word to translate, but it basically means one who gathers or assembles in order to teach. As you can see from the NIV footnote, if you're using an NIV, an alternative title is therefore leader of the assembly. The teacher of Ecclesiastes is someone who has the role of addressing a gathering, a congregation of God's people. This is also where the name of the book comes from. Ecclesiastes is taken from the Greek word ecclesia, which is the common New Testament word for a gathering or assembly of people to worship God. It's most often translated in the New Testament as church. So pulling all of that together, the teacher is therefore a bit like a pastor or a preacher, which is actually how that word is translated in some other translations, addressing a congregation on a Sunday, imparting God's wisdom, God's word about how to live in a fallen world. But can we be any more specific about the identity of the teacher than that? Well, the author doesn't identify himself by name, but there are clues throughout Ecclesiastes to his identity. So for example, in chapter 1 verse 1 and in chapter 1 verse 12, the teacher describes himself as the son of David and as the king over Israel and over Jerusalem. Now, those are titles that could only refer to one person in the Old Testament, and that's Solomon, because he was the only son of David who ruled over a united Israel with Jerusalem as the capital city. And Solomon's life experience matches the experience the teacher describes in Ecclesiastes. Solomon asked for God for wisdom to rule Israel well, and God granted him his request. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 11. But while he started off well, he ended up pursuing wealth and pleasure in much the same way that the teacher does in chapter 2. If you look at 1 Corinthians 11, you'll see that. Solomon's heart was drawn away from God to other things, to pursue joy and contentment and meaning in other things, and ultimately none of which satisfied him. And that's very similar to the teacher's experience in chapter 2. And so traditionally, Ecclesiastes has been seen as the work of an older, wiser, repentant King Solomon, reflecting on his mistakes and trying to pass on what he has learned, so that we don't make the same mistakes. It's worth flagging up that some theologians suggest the book wasn't written by King Solomon, but by another author who took on the persona or the character of King Solomon as a bit of a cautionary tale for us. But in reality, it doesn't really matter which view you take. Whether the author is an older and repentant King Solomon or someone taking on the persona of Solomon to teach us a cautionary tale, the key thing is that the author is a believer. That's the key thing to remember. Throughout the book, he continues to have faith in God, no matter how cynical, despairing or disillusioned he becomes. And that's really important to remember. because sometimes he says things that suggest the complete opposite, such as, everything is meaningless. But the teacher is not an unbeliever, and he has not abandoned his faith in God. He's a believer who takes a brutally honest look at life in a fallen world and asks the questions that most believers don't verbalise and are a bit afraid to ask, particularly about why life often feels so disappointing and why we so often struggle for joy. And so this is a helpful book for us because it answers the questions that we sometimes struggle to articulate, but that deep down we do sometimes think about. And that brings us on to the next basic question. Who's the audience of the book? Answer: Ecclesiastes is written for believers. It's not very clear who Ecclesiastes was written for, but throughout the book the teacher assumes some kind of faith in God in his readers. And again, that's important. It's important for us to remember because much of the book is concerned with showing how the pursuit of things such as pleasure, power, wealth and relationships don't bring lasting joy. Now, as believers, we know that, don't we? We know that. But so often we forget that. And as a result, we sometimes have unrealistic expectations about what life should be like in this world. And we can end up disillusioned and disappointed when things don't work out as we'd hoped. And so while Ecclesiastes has an application to unbelievers, we'll be picking that up on Sunday mornings particularly, in showing that lasting joy and satisfaction and contentment and meaning is impossible if we ignore God, the original audience was believers. The teacher wants to show us from painful personal experience that we mustn't have unrealistic expectations about life in a fallen world, even as believers. So then fourthly, is there any obvious structure to the book? Answer: the bookends of Ecclesiastes are key. Like most wisdom literature, the structure of Ecclesiastes is quite difficult to pin down. By nature, wisdom literature is discursive and exploratory and kind of wanders around different themes and circles around things. But what is clear is that the introduction and conclusion, that the bookends, if you like, of Ecclesiastes are critical to understanding the theme of the book. So chapter 1 verses 1 to 11 is the introduction of the book, and in that introduction we are given a key question in verse 3. We'll look at this in a moment, but it's important to recognise that verse 3 is really the question, the key question that drives the rest of the book. And then from verse 12 of chapter 1 right through to almost the end of the book, chapter 12 verse 7, we get the teacher's search for joy in different places. In chapters 1 to 6, it's mainly through his own personal experience. And then in chapters 7 to 12, mainly through thoughtful reflection on life. And then in chapter 12, the last chapter of the book and the last few verses of the book, is the conclusion and the answer to the key question in chapter 1 verse 3. So the introduction and the conclusion really stand out as the bookends because they refer to the teacher in the third person, whereas the middle section he speaks directly to us. And that's caused some to suggest that the introduction and conclusion were written by a different author. That's possible. But it may equally be a literary technique employed by the teacher when the book was compiled to introduce and to conclude as a way of kind of summarising and introducing the main body of the book. That would be my guess. It kind of is a bookend introducing the teacher's search for meaning. But in the introduction in verse 3, we get a key question which the teacher then takes the rest of the book to answer. And this is the question that drives his quest in chapters 2 to 12, and it gives unity to the whole book. Have a look at verse 3 of chapter 1. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? That is the key question of the book. What do people gain from all their labours, from all their toil under the sun? Now, we have to wait until the conclusion before we're giving a definitive answer to that question. However, the teacher does answer it in a number of different ways throughout the book, and we're going to see those as we work through them on Sunday mornings and a bit later on in this seminar as well. The bulk of the book are the middle chapters, however, which describe the teacher's quest to answer that question and discover lasting joy in a fallen world. Firstly, through personal experience, and then secondly, through thoughtful reflection. It's hard to see a more detailed structure than that in the middle part of the book, but as I've said, that's not unusual in wisdom literature because by its nature it's more discursive and exploratory. David Gibson, who has written one of the best books on Ecclesiastes, I'll mention it at the end, explains it like this. He says this: precisely because it is an experiential quest, this middle body of the book should not be neatly organised into a linear argument. The material moves from subject to subject, while at the same time circling around repeated themes, coming at them again from new angles. Okay then, we've looked at these 4 basic questions. What is Ecclesiastes all about then? There are 3 main recurring phrases in Ecclesiastes that help us see what Ecclesiastes is all about. Let's work through them now one by one. Firstly, the phrase "everything is meaningless." That's a phrase that's actually used 38 times in the book. We get it in almost at the very first verse of the book, verse 2 of chapter 1. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. It's a key recurring phrase in the book. The teacher says time and time and time again that everything is meaningless. And when we look at the wider context of those verses, we see that he really does mean everything. When we look at the context of some of those other times when he refers to everything being meaningless, it means everything: pleasure, possessions, projects, power, wealth, work, wine, entertainment, music, laughter, sex, marriage, family, even wisdom itself. All of these things he terms meaningless. But to understand why he says that, we need to look a little closer at the Hebrew word translated meaningless. That word is actually translated a number of different ways in other Bible translations. Pointless, futile, for example. The word he uses, the Hebrew word, is the word hevel, which means smoke, or mist, or vapour, or breath. The teacher is saying that life in a fallen world is like smoke. Any happiness is brief and fleeting and impossible to hold on to. Theologian Philip Ryken says this in his commentary: the Hebrew word for vanity, hevel, is the preacher's multi-purpose metaphor, image, to express the futility of life in a fallen world. Taken literally, the word refers to a breath or vapour, like steam rising from a boiling kettle. Just keep that image in mind. Such is life. It is impossible to grasp, and before you know it, life is gone. It vanishes into thin air. It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it? And it's the key metaphor really in Ecclesiastes. Just when we feel that life is good, things change. And ultimately, one day, we will all die. The Message Bible helpfully paraphrases verses 2 and 3 of chapter 1 like this. I think this gets to the heart of what the word means. Smoke, nothing but smoke. There's nothing to anything. It's all smoke. What's there to show for a lifetime of work, a lifetime of working your fingers to the bone? The question the teacher struggles to answer throughout the book is what the purpose of life is when it seems so transient and fleeting. And this idea of life as a vapour a breath, a mist, a smoke that's here today and gone tomorrow, helps explain one of the other recurring metaphors in Ecclesiastes. Happiness and contentment, the teacher says, often feels like, here's the phrase, chasing after the wind. That phrase is used 10 times in Ecclesiastes. It's another powerful metaphor, image. Life is like chasing after the wind. Happiness and contentment is like chasing after the wind. In other words, it's an exercise in futility. It's a meaningless, pointless, impossible task. Just when things in life seem happy, things change. Lasting happiness, joy and contentment is like trying to catch the wind. Now that is a pretty bleak message for a believer to express, isn't it? You'd be calling in the counsellors if someone said that to you on a Sunday morning or in your small group. How do you square that with the worldview of the Bible? What is this book doing in the Bible? Well, that's where the third recurring phrase is so significant, because it shows us the perspective of the teacher. 38 times he locates his search for meaning as being, here's the phrase, under the sun. 38 times. Actually, in 3 other places, he uses the equivalent phrase under the heavens to mean the same thing. So 41 times the teacher says that his search for meaning and the sense of futility that he has is because he's looking at life under the sun. That gives us the perspective of the teacher. He is looking, you see, at life with blinkers on from a limited perspective. He's only looking at life under the sun. The teacher, you see, is showing us the futility of life if we only ever live for the things in this world, and if we never raise our gaze to see what's above the sun and beyond our limited time on earth. One of the handouts is a diagram, which is my attempt to convey this in pictorial form. If you're like me and you're a visual learner, hopefully you'll find that helpful. But Ecclesiastes, you see, shows us what life looks like when we lose sight of God and of eternity, and when we only focus on this world and what this world has to offer at life under the sun. The teacher says if we only ever look at life under the sun, we'll never find lasting joy because our world is fallen. And look, while there's an obvious application to unbelievers there, again, we need to remember that this is a book written by a believer to believers. And look, that's dynamite pastorally, because what that implies is that functionally, this is how we can often live as believers. We can get too caught up in this world and its pleasures and achievements and accomplishments and lose sight of the reality of God and eternity. And to those of us tempted to live like that, and let's be honest, that's all of us, Ecclesiastes is meant to be a warning. No matter how good it is, life under the sun in a fallen world will eventually disappoint and frustrate us. And if we're not careful, we will become resentful and miserable and cynical, a bit like the teacher. And that's because of 2 main realities that are repeatedly picked up in Ecclesiastes. We don't have time to go into them now. There are verses on the handout which you can look up if you want to. But there are 2 recurring realities that the teacher comes back to again and again throughout Ecclesiastes, and that really make him feel that life is futile. Life in a fallen world often feels meaningless because, number 1, life is often unfair and unjust. And number 2, death is inevitable and unavoidable. Now, we're not going to go into detail about those 2 realities now. Look up the verses on the handout if you want to see more about them. But this is why trying to find joy in a fallen world is like trying to catch the wind. This is why life lived under the sun, and only with that perspective, is like a breath or a mist. Life is often uncertain and frustrating. It is here today and gone tomorrow. So, how can we find joy in a fallen world? What's the answer that the teacher gives us? Well, I think there are 4 answers in the book, at least 4. Let me run through them now. Firstly, and the one that's repeated most often really, is this: recognise God's good gifts in everyday life. As we've said, chapter 1 verse 3 is the question that drives the rest of Ecclesiastes. Let me remind you of it. The teacher says, what do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? This question of what we gain from all our labours under the sun is an issue the teacher returns to again and again. For example, let me just take you quickly through a few verses. Have your Bible open and let's turn to them with me. We've obviously just looked at chapter 1 verse 3. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? Then look at chapter 2 and verse 11. Everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Then verse 15 of chapter 2, I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. Chapter 3, verse 9, what do workers gain from their toil? And then chapter 5 and verse 16. As everyone comes, so they depart, and what do they gain since they toil for the wind? This constant search for gain, that's what ultimately disillusions the teacher, because he can't see how it's possible to hang on to whatever we gain or achieve or accomplish. So what's the point of trying? Any gain we get in this life is only ever fleeting. It's like smoke, it's gone so quickly. And death means any gain we get is never permanent. And so the answer to the teacher's question in chapter 1 verse 3, the question that drives the whole book, is nothing. We gain nothing that lasts from life under the sun. So how is it possible to have lasting joy in a fallen world? Well, the teacher's answer is found in a number of enjoyment passages in Ecclesiastes. On the handouts, I've listed them. In these enjoyment passages, the teacher looks at life under the sun from a different perspective, which give him a different mindset. Rather than looking for what we can gain from life, he encourages us to see life as a gift from God. If you look up all of those verses, that's the word that stands out in almost all of them. Life as a gift from God. The teacher encourages us to cultivate thankfulness and the enjoyment of the everyday, ordinary, good gifts that God gives. Even in a fallen world that so often disappoints us and frustrates us, God still gives us good gifts to enjoy. For example, just have a look at chapter 2 and verse 24. In chapter 2, he experiments with every type of pleasure that the earth has to offer. He tries to kind of give himself meaning in life by trying out everything. But his conclusion is that none of it gives him lasting joy or contentment or a sense of meaning. And so he says this in verse 24 of chapter 2. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. See, in the end, the teacher learns to find joy and contentment in the ordinary, everyday things of life that God gives. Food, drink, work. Things that we often take for granted or we just kind of assume. Things that we feel we're entitled to, actually. But the teacher gives us another perspective on those things. They're not things we're entitled to. They are gifts from a good God who loves us. He encourages us to look at life under the sun from a different perspective, to look at the everyday ordinary things of life as gifts from God, and in response to be thankful for them. It's interesting, while he refers to life as meaningless 38 times in Ecclesiastes, he uses the word good 51 times in the book. Interesting contrast, isn't it? In a book that seems so gloomy and pessimistic, actually, the teacher sees good things more times than he sees meaningless things. You see, while this world is fallen and therefore often frustrating and disappointing, it is still full of good gifts from the hand of a good God who gives us his grace. And so Ecclesiastes is therefore a warning to us as believers against living with a sense of entitlement, thinking we deserve certain things, we deserve to have or gain certain things. They're our right. Living that way only leads to discontent, resentment and cynicism, and bitterness if we don't get what we think we deserve. Rather, the teacher encourages us to cultivate thankfulness and gratitude and worship for the ordinary, everyday gifts God gives. He encourages us to have eyes that see those things and gives thanks for them. Theologian Philip Ryken puts it like this: life's enjoyments are not guilty pleasures, but godly pleasures, or at least they ought to be. A merry heart has God's approval. It is part of his gracious will for our lives. And although this seems a pessimistic book, that's its aim, to give us a merry heart as we see God's kindness to us in the everyday ordinary things of life. Now, of course, ultimately, as believers, we have an added reason to be thankful, don't we? Because we've experienced the extraordinary grace of God in Jesus and the hope that he gives even in the face of death. There is something, you see, that we can gain in this life that will outlast death: eternal life. And so even when life is hard, we still have reason to be joyful. Not just in seeing God's good gifts to us in the ordinary, everyday things of life, but ultimately in his good gift to us in the person of Jesus and the eternal life that we have gained through him. But look, that isn't the only answer the teacher gives to how to find joy in a fallen world. More briefly now, secondly, the teacher says, don't look in the wrong places for contentment and joy. This is the focus of chapters 2 to 6 particularly, which are more biographical in nature, where the teacher describes his fruitless search for joy and contentment. But his purpose in doing this, in showing us this, is to show us not to seek joy in the wrong places by pursuing the things in this world. Look, this is something we constantly need to be reminded of, isn't it? Even as believers. If we seek happiness and contentment and joy in this world, we will always be disappointed. We're not to set our hearts on earthly things, but on things under the sun. I wonder if you recognise that kind of phrase from somewhere in the New Testament. Well, Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul says, "Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things." We might paraphrase, on things under the sun. If we want to find joy in a fallen world, we mustn't look in the wrong places. That's one of the key lessons of Ecclesiastes. Then thirdly, the teacher also says we find joy, even in a fallen world, when we remember that God is our creator and he is in ultimate control. Although the teacher searches in all the wrong places for joy and contentment, God is not absent from Ecclesiastes. He is the one the teacher turns to again and again when whatever he's pursuing disappoints him. Even when things seem meaningless and he's despairing, the teacher returns again and again to the fact that God is there and that he is the creator who is in control even over a fallen world. And so at various times in the book, and you have the references in the handout, the teacher says the following things about God. He says God gives us life and breath and determines how long we will live. He says God is in charge of the times and seasons of our lives. There's a time to live and a time to die, a time to laugh, a time to weep. That section in chapter 3 that's very famous. He says that God is sovereign over the good and bad times we go through. He says God gives us our wealth and our possessions. All the good things that we have are from him. He says God gives us wisdom and happiness. And he says that God will one day judge everyone. Even though the teacher struggles with the transient nature of life, he always returns to the fact that God is in control, and he encourages us to accept that as well. And as we learn to trust that God's plans are perfect, even when we don't understand why life is unfair or unjust or things are hard, we can, like the teacher, rest secure and be delivered from frustration and resentment and bitterness and know joy. Yes, even in a fallen world. And then, fourthly, lastly, the teacher also says that we find joy when we remember that God will make things right one day. At the very end of the book, the teacher gives a definitive answer to his question in chapter 1 and verse 3. We have to wait actually to almost the last verses of the book. The teacher's answer is that we need to fear God and obey him and remember that one day he will make all things right. Let me read you what he says there. Verse 13 and 14 of chapter 12. Now, all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it's good or evil. The teacher's answer to that big question that he poses in chapter 1 verse 3, as to kind of what we gain in this world, how to find meaning in this world, he says, fear God and obey him, have a right awe and reverence of him, submission to him, follow his word, because one day he will judge the world. And while that might not seem to be a very positive answer, it's actually a call to hope. You see, throughout the Old Testament, the judgment of God is seen as, on the one hand, a terrifying thing for an unbeliever, but on the other hand, a joyful thing for a believer. Let me just give you one example of that. Psalm 96 verse 13 says this, "Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth." God's judgment in the Bible is a good thing if you're a believer, because it means that one day he will come and banish sin and its effects for good, and finally the world will be put right. That is the hope of the Old Testament when it comes to the judgment of God. And so as Ecclesiastes finishes, we're encouraged to remember that this fallen world will not stay fallen. One day everything that's wrong and unfair and frustrating will be put right forever. And of course, as New Testament believers, we have the advantage of knowing who the judge will be. One day Jesus will return as judge and he will make all things new. At one point in chapter 2, the teacher says, there is nothing new under the sun. Well, one day there will be. One day there will be. One day everything will be made new. Everything will be put right. This world will no longer be a fallen world anymore. And ultimately that hope is to be the source of our joy. Even, yes, in the mess of a fallen world with all its pain and heartache. Jesus is risen, and so we know there is hope beyond the grave. In fact, his resurrection changes everything. Just if you've got a Bible, flick over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as we finish. Paul concludes this great chapter on the resurrection by saying that nothing we do for Christ because of the resurrection is ever meaningless or vanity. The last verse of 1 Corinthians 15 says this, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. You see, that's the difference that Jesus makes. This is the New Testament perspective. Life isn't vanity. Life isn't meaningless. Life isn't futile. As believers, because Jesus is raised from the dead, has overcome death, nothing we do for him is ever in vain, is ever meaningless. And so we're to work hard and serve Jesus because we know that he is risen, and nothing we do for him, our labour for him, is never in vain. Look, I hope you found that a helpful introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. In the handout, there's an extra section right at the back on how to read Ecclesiastes as a Christian, and hopefully you'll find that helpful as you look through the book. We read it through New Testament eyes, through Christian eyes, which means that we mustn't lose the original meaning of the book to its original audience, and there are things we can learn from that, and we've seen that today. But it also, we read it slightly differently because of Jesus. So have a look at that section as well in the handout, how to read Ecclesiastes as a Christian. And if you want one book recommendation, there are a number on the handout that I mentioned. This is the one that I would really recommend, Destiny by David Gibson. He works through the book passage by passage, but it's not a close exposition. It's a brilliant kind of summary of the heart of the book, the meaning of the book, and really well applied into a contemporary situation. So I encourage you to get hold of that if you want something to read along with the series that we're going to be doing on Sundays and that our growth groups are going to be doing as well. I hope you enjoy looking through Ecclesiastes. Remember, it's not a gloomy book. It is actually a book full of hope, and we're going to see that together. I look forward to you joining us then.